Welcome back, and without further ado, I introduce Professor Peter Tyler, Professor of Pastoral Theology and Spirituality at St Mary's University in Twickenham, who hosted our first Friends of Sophia conference 4 years ago. Thank you. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Dominic. Can you all see me at home and hear me at home? Can they all hear me and see me? Can they all see? Yeah? Yeah, okay, because I can't see you, I'm afraid. All I can see is the presentation. And everyone can hear me okay here? Yeah. Great. Okay, then let's go. So this is all really a little dance at the end. We've had all the heavy lifting, so my role is really just to bring things to a conclusion with a merry dance. I mean, we started the conference last night with a merry dance in the cathedral, which was extraordinary, really, and Dominic is to be praised for setting that up, because I've studied this dance and read about it for 20, 30 years. I've never thought I'd actually do it in a cathedral. And to be honest, doing it in the cathedral was a completely different experience than thinking about it. And I'm so glad that that's how we began the conference. Now, what I'm giving you today is quite strange in a way. This is a conference paper that didn't have a conference, and it was written as a conference paper, and now it's found a conference in which it can live, so that's nice. It was a platonic form of a conference paper, and now it's become a conference in a conference. And it's going to be published. It came out of a conference that was held at Cambridge called Deus Ludens, the God who plays. And that was organised by one of the academics at Cambridge called Daniel Soares. And the book, I think, is going to come out in the next 12 to 24 months. It's called Deus Ludens, the God who plays. And at that conference, it was a very, very good conference, and the book will be fantastic. I attended the conference, and at the end, I said to Daniel, but you haven't done anything on play, on jokes, on humour, etc., etc. And so he said, I mean, it's a fatal thing to say, he said, well, why don't you write that? You know, famous retort. So I said, okay. And like Margaret was saying earlier about the Cosmati pavement, it's something I've always been interested in. I mean, those of you who know me, last night, Margaret and I had a very long conversation about British 1970s children's television. So we went through Bagpuss, the Clangers, Ivor the Engine. Some of you will smile, some of you won't have a clue what I'm talking about. But, and another example, we had a appraisal at my university a few years ago, and we had to comment on each other's lecturing styles. And one of my colleagues slightly unhelpfully said, well, Professor's style is stand-up. That's his way of lecturing. It's using humour. So humour and the role of humour has always been something that's fascinated me. And like Margaret this morning, I thought, well, this is a good excuse to write an academic paper on the subject. As Hines reminds us, who's written on this subject, we must remember that there is a Western cultural bias against allowing humour to represent serious and important cultural information, with our common assumption that, quote, if something is comical or entertaining, it cannot represent socially significant, or we could add religiously significant material. If nothing else, God's play allows humour, laughter, and laughter to enter into the hallowed halls of theological discussion. And what was beautiful last night in the dance, the first dance we did was we were all concentrating on our steps, and it was I found it quite difficult to do. The second dance, Dominic threw balls at us, which was a bit disconcerting, but what happened after the initial fear of, and with my eyesight, it's very difficult when someone throws a ball at me. But after the initial fear, we all started giggling and laughing, and the whole thing lightened up. And then I found actually I could dance better. I mean, I'm the world's worst dancer, but I found that my whole body responded to the humor in the situation. So often we may laugh, but a deeper is unfolding as at work. And one of the key figures that's represented in this respect is the trickster in tradition. You know, the trickster bears the gift of laughter, but is often for the trickster tied to another level, linked to another gift, one that enables insight and enlightenment. It's hermetic, it can move between levels, the conscious, the unconscious. In this respect, certain mid-20th century commentators, by the way, this is our maze, this is our labyrinth on the floor of Chartres, and there you can see all the chairs on it. That's how you can normally see, and as we heard the other day, the chairs are often removed. So one of the key mid-century commentators on this subject who wanted to recover the importance of play in social, philosophical, and even theological contexts was the Dutch academic whose name I shall now maul, Johann Huizinga. I have probably pronounced that very badly, whose mid-century book, Homo Ludens, had a lasting effect on the emergence of the current discipline of what we could now call play studies. And there is a lot of literature on this subject, by the way. And to prepare this paper, I had to read an awful lot of material, far more than I thought existed. In fact, if I had known of the existence of the literature, I probably wouldn't have written the paper in the first place. And like Heine's, Huizinga stressed the difficulty of categorizing play and how it eludes facile intellectual classification. He wrote, "The fun of playing resists all analyses, all logical interpretation. As a concept, it cannot be reduced to any other mental category. No other modern language known to me has the exact equivalent of the English fun." However, Huizinga was at pains to distinguish his play or fun from the more medieval notion of folly. For him, play could not really embrace the more extreme liminal aspects of the latter. He wrote, "The category of the comic is certainly connected with folly in the highest and lowest sense of that word. Play, however, is not foolish. It lies outside the antithesis of wisdom and folly. The later Middle Ages tended to express the two cardinal modes of life, play and seriousness, somewhat imperfectly by opposing folie to sense, until Erasmus in his Laus Stultitia showed the inadequacy of the contrast." The other important 20th century voice who's worth mentioning in the development of a Christian understanding of play was the brother of the famous Jesuit, German Jesuit, Karl Rahner. His brother was called Hugo Rahner, and he wrote a very influential book in 1965 called, a very strange title it's got, called Man at Play, because it's pre, woke times, Man at Play, or Did You Ever Practice Eutrapelia? That's the way to sell your books, isn't it? And he wanted to use the writings of Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle to baptize a Christian sense of play and humor. Here we go again, a middle way, we had this morning, a middle way between foolishness and the dullard.
But you'll be back on Thursday, won't you? Because there's 2 lots of runs.
I think
so on Wednesday, I have to drop Chloe to St Swithun's to Ava's at 4. That's fine. I can take the girls with me. On Thursday, I will have to collect Chloe, and I don't know what time yet. But Florence and Isabel have got a birthday party at 2 to 4 at Rocker, near Southampton, where Chloe had.
Jenny, we can all hear you. You need to mute.
Welcome back, Peter.
Well, it broke the ice, didn't it? I planned that, by the way. I planned that. That's lovely. Thank you. Exactly. All planned. All planned. Thank you very much. Yeah. So, as we had this morning, a middle way between that of the fool and the dollard. This he would do by promoting the ideas of what he calls the utrapelos person, who, quote, strikes the happy means between the, I can't pronounce this, the bomolokos, the inveterate funny man. You know, there's always someone, isn't there, who's always cracking a joke, the buffoon, and the agrokos, the humorless man who never as much smiles. Following Aquinas and Aristotle, he argued that for Christians, unmitigated seriousness reveals a lack of virtue on account of the fact that it despises play. Thus, for Rana, eutrapelic Christians are able to stand between two extremes of loutishness and priggishness, expressing a refined joy in the pleasure of the divine game upon earth, which I think is more or less what we were doing yesterday. I don't think we were either loutish or priggish, you know. So we were in that middle zone that Rana's suggesting. Another figure that I could give you a whole paper on, in fact, probably Mother Sarah and Tamara would be better placed to give a paper on. Another figure where this manifests itself in the Christian tradition is the Orthodox tradition of the Holy Fool. Foolishness, as St. Paul reminds us, lies at the heart of Christian discipleship. He says in the first letter of Corinthians, we are fools for the sake of Christ, but you are wise in Christ. For God's foolishness, as shown through the power of crucifixions we've seen throughout today, is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. In the post-apostolic period, one of the first and most cited sources referring to the Holy Fool in the Eastern tradition is that of Leontius of Neapolis's The Life of Simeon the Holy Fool. Recent commentators such as Johnson and Kruger have questioned the actual existence of Simeon as a person. But what is clear on rereading the life of Simeon is that the trope of the Holy Fool was a legitimate one for Leontius to adopt in the mid-7th century. The figure of Holy Fool Simeon, as portrayed in the life, has many of the classic characteristics of the trickster, especially his liminality, transformative qualities, and capacity to play. Although several elements in the Simeon story reflect the prevailing tendency amongst the desert dwellers to offer challenging and sometimes eccentric examples to their followers. What is notable with Simeon's story is the deliberate desire to mock the world. So we hear in the account of Simeon, having received his call, he enters the city of Emesa in Turkey, pulling a dead dog on a lead. And if you Google him, you'll find several icons where he's pulling a dead dog behind him, and proceeds to disrupt the religious services by throwing walnuts at parishioners, dancing in the streets, and disobeying the rules of Lent by publicly eating meat. This was accompanied by his befriending prostitutes and actors and visiting brothels and taverns. Although, as we are told in life, he remained untouched by vice during these sojourns. By breaking taboos and transgressing social and sexual norms, Simeon, like the fellow holy fool often cited in the Eastern tradition, Andreas the Fool for Christ, displays extreme behavior that fits well into classic descriptions of the trickster found, for example, in the writings of Jung, to which we'll come back later, or Radin. Despite the fact that the tradition of holy foolery seems to have survived in the Eastern Orthodox tradition well into the 19th century, as depicted in sources as diverse as the novels of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and famously, from my point of view, Modest Mussorgsky's great opera, Boris Godunov, which ends with the Holy Fool lamenting the suffering of Holy Russia. The tradition nevertheless seems to have become a central, never seemed to have become a central part in Christian practices. Basically, it remained a marginal and somewhat eccentric aspect of Christian life. True to his marginality, the Orthodox Holy Fool seems to have had more in common with the fakirs and bowels of self, that's B-A-U-L-S, not B-O-W-E-L-S, the bowels. I once met one of these bowels of South Asia. These are wild men, holy men and women who you can still encounter in northern India and Pakistan. And as I say, I have met them over the years. Like Simeon and Andreas, these holy men and women, these fakirs and bowels, have no respect for the boundaries and proprieties of everyday orthodoxy and clearly exist on the boundaries of organized religion. Although all these figures are fascinating to study and very enjoyable to study, I must say, you could spend hours reading their accounts. And they do present a challenge to normative approaches to Christian practice. It's clear that the life of the fool or the fakir is a specialized and special calling that, if it is divinely inspired, and who am I to say, it clearly is only given to a very few and rarely at that. So having presented these two various phenomena of tricksterism and foolery, I want to conclude the paper by seeing if there could be an answer to the question, is there a place for the trickster or the fool tradition within present day Christianity? And if so, how would it look? And to do that, I'm going to refer to, and this in a way brings us to the theme of the conference, refer to the tradition of the Feast of Fools and how it fitted into the medieval geography of the cathedral. Anyway, during this today, we've had these incredible visions of how the cathedral worked as a cosmological entity. But I suppose what I'm proposing is, how would that actually have worked on the ground for the people living in the medieval period, or indeed the people today? One of the most memorable passages in Jung's essay on the trickster is his description of the medieval Feast of Fools. Taking his descriptions mainly from the 17th century accounts of Cange, Jung uses the later reports of the phenomenon to press his case that for the existence of the trickster as what he calls a psychologion. He says, it is obviously an archetypal psychic structure of extreme antiquity. In his clearer manifestations, he is a faithful reflection of an undifferentiated human consciousness, corresponding to a psyche that has hardly left the animal level. To make this argument, he demonstrates a well-worn trope that the medieval Feast of Fools, occurring in days after Christmas and culminating on the Feast of the Circumcision, 1st of January. I mean, it's that time, when you've had Christmas and before you go back to work after New Year, you never quite know what to do, and you wake up, between Christmas and New Year, you don't even know what day it is, you're a bit hungover, and it's that's this sort of crazy time when they celebrated the Feast of Fools, and it ended, or it culminated, the Feast of the Circumcision, the 1st of January. And Jung argues that it is a relic of the ancient Roman Servula or Servulus festival that, quote, took place on the calends of January and was a kind of New Year's festival at which people exchanged gifts, dressed up as animals or old women, and danced through the streets singing to the applause of the populace. Presumably that's what these folk are doing in front of us here. This notion that the pre-Christian Servulus persisted into the Christian Middle Ages, and by the way, just Google this, you'll find a lot of this idea has persisted into the modern world, and that it underlay the post-nativity festivals in medieval Christian Europe, especially France, is an abiding one and found in many commentators. As we can expect from Jung's prose here, he revels in the absurd situation and quotes Du Cange's late description, the 17th century description of the misrule with relish. This is what Du Cange writes, 1666. In the very midst of divine service, masqueraders with grotesque faces disguised as women, lions, mummers, performed their dances, sang indecent songs in the choir, ate their greasy food, they obviously had McDonald's in those days, ate their greasy food from a corner of the altar near the priest celebrating mass, got out their games of dice, burned a stinking incense made of old shoe leather, and ran and hopped about all over the church. Jung also embellishes his description with account of the so-called liturgy of the ass, Festum Asinorum, seemingly celebrated at Beauvais Cathedral in the memoriam of the flight of the Holy Family to Egypt on an ass, and incorporating, according to Du Cange, quoted by Jung, a responsory for the congregation, where after each part, Kyrie, Gloria, etc., of the High Mass that followed, the whole congregation brayed, Jung's emphasis, that is, they all went ye are like a donkey. And the whole service concluded so that at the end of Mass, instead of the words ita missa est, the priest would bray 3 times, and instead of the words Deo gratias, the congregation shall answer ye are 3 times. Amusing and intriguing, although these accounts are, and Jung, of course, milks them for all their worth in their entertainment value, Max Harris, in 2011, in his book Sacred Folly, A New History of the Feast of Fools, painstakingly combs through the French cathedral records to disentangle the reality of the Festum Stultorum from the layers of myth that have built up around it, especially in the hands of the 17th century writers such as Du Cange. What, in my view, he conclusively demonstrates is that, with all due respect to Jung, the Festum did have a clear liturgical and theological purpose, whose aims have been clearly distorted by later attacks, and especially the cartoonish exaggerations of the 17th and 18th centuries. The existence and occurrence of the Festum Asinorum, as described by Du Cange, is dubious in the extreme. And in his description of the 1st of January Festum Stultorum, Du Cange runs together descriptions from diverse sources, usually unsympathetic or hostile ones, such as the Parisian masters, who wrote a letter of condemnation in 1444. Peering through this liturgical fog, Harris, however, is able to piece together an explanation for the practices so strongly libelled at a later date. What then was the purpose of this feast, and how does it link to this conference's pursuit of wisdom in stone? As Harris points out, the first person to make explicit mention of the Festum Stultorum is John Belleth in his Summa de Ecclesiasticis Office from 1160 to 1164. In his description, Belleth notes, "It is customary for archbishops and bishops to play with their subordinates in the cathedral close and even to indulge in a ball game." What was this ball game and how did it relate to the Festum Stultorum? For authors such as Harris, the ball game was almost certainly a form of liturgical dance, so almost certainly what we were doing last night, that was performed in French medieval cathedrals such as Auxerre, sometimes along the labyrinth that we heard about this morning, inscribed into the nave. This is Harris's description. Early in the afternoon of Easter Sunday, The dean has as many as, quote, 100 canons. Can you imagine? 100 canons. We had difficulty with 18 yesterday. 100 canons would gather, your internet connection is unstable. 100 canons would gather at a paved stone labyrinth that we heard about this morning, set into the floor at the west end of the nave. That is important. The newest member of the chapter carried a large leather ball. In 1412, the cathedral chapter ordered that the ball should be smaller than usual, but too large to be grasped in one man's hand, requiring two hands to stop it. You remember that next time. It was perhaps the size of a soccer ball. Once assembled, the cathedral chapter would initiate the game dance, as described in this manuscript account, 1538. This is very interesting. The dean began to sing antiphonally the appropriate Easter sequence, exactly as we did last night, Victimae, paschali, laudes. Then he took the ball with his left hand and danced the tripudium, repeatedly in time to the music, while the others joined hands, as we did last night, and danced the chorea, the circle dance. And listen to this, around the circa Daedalum, the labyrinth, the circus of Daedalus that we heard about this morning. While they danced, the dean would deliver the ball alternately to each and every one of the dancers, who were in the form of a garland, certi in spetium, and they would throw it back. There was sport, and the meter of the dance was led by the organ. So I think we did a very good job last night. Well done, Dominic. No stinking leather shoe incense, no clergy dressed as animals or old women, and definitely no donkey brain. And next year. The Auxerre dance game, and evidence for others comes from Sens, Rennes, Amiens, and Chartres, suggest a more stately measure that had a clear intention to reinstate the Deus Ludens, the God who plays, at the heart of the post-Easter liturgy. What are we to make of this, and how does it fit into the argument of this conference? The first thing to note, as Harris reminds us, is that acceptable behaviour in a medieval cathedral was probably quite different from what is the norm today, as any of you know if you've been into Wells Cathedral today. Whereas the altar and choir would have been set aside for liturgical functions, the saying of Mass and the recital of office, the nave, so again, Tom's wonderful account this morning, the nave was the place of earth, if you remember the square shape, and then the Lady Chapel was the heaven. The nave could often serve more as a people's space, and the situation of the game dance there is congruent with the more democratic forms of devotional practice that would predominate in that space. So again, it would make sense, I think, that the labyrinths, as we saw this morning, are usually situated at the entrance of the nave, not in the Lady Chapel. You will know better than me, but I don't know an instance of a labyrinth in a Lady Chapel. And that would make sense then that the dance would be taking place in that part. Secondly, Harris argues that foisting pagan interpretations onto these medieval practices seems to over-theorize practices that can be given quite legitimate Christian interpretations. As Dominic said yesterday, Christ as the rising sun, for example, represented in the ball. Recent scholars, such as Dominic White, have done just that. In his Lost Knowledge of Christ, and if you haven't read it, I do recommend that you read it. It's essential reading. A more recent work, he explores how he has adapted the Auxerre dance play for contemporary use, and found that contemporary Christians and spiritual seekers have responded very positively, as we did last night, to the incorporation of movement within the liturgical context. Now, sharing your blushes, Dominic, I'm going to quote you now. I always feel when people do this to me, I'm dead, you know, it's like, so as Dominic, as Dr. White says, many devout people complain of distractions in prayer, that all their lives whirl around in their heads when they sit still to pray. Perhaps if we brought back the movement of our bodies to prayer, we'd be able to be more still. What might at first sight look like a pagan hangover is in fact the deepest teaching about angels and stars, one that we need to understand if the angelic dance is to become part of our lives. And again, I think that's been the great takeaway from the conference for me, is to show how the practical incorporation of the dance that we did last night fits into the theology that we've done today. I think the two components, and that's very much the message of the Friends of Sophia. We're not just a headspace, you know, there's enough headspaces in the world, and we're not just unthinking, going out there doing it. We're trying to incorporate the two. So might then the divine dance of the medieval Feast of Fools offer a path back for contemporary seekers to the origins of their faith in its divine milieu, and also perhaps open up these riches that we've discovered today. So in conclusion, in areas such as the trickster, Jung, I think quite literally misses a trick. In his desire to find a supposed hidden pagan root behind all that cannot be explained in, for example, medieval Christianity, he misses, as I have argued here, a theological or psycho-spiritual perspective that allows such seemingly eccentric practices to perform a very legitimate function, a very important function within the body of Christ, within the church. The first candidate I explored for this function, the holy fool, I felt in a way is deemed too extreme and extraordinary to act as a containing vessel for more day-to-day life within contemporary Christianity. However, the second tradition we've looked at, the ludic liturgies of the medieval Feast of Fools, struck us as more promising. And as we saw, they fulfilled the three Christian qualities that we laid out earlier: liminality, transformation, and play, whilst having good liturgical and theological precedent. The phenomenon of the return of the labyrinth and liturgical dance to contemporary liturgy, albeit in a somewhat piecemeal fashion, attests to the sense that the Holy Feast of Fools could once again find a home within the more stately and somber day-to-day liturgies of the church. However, as I would like to end with, this suggestion comes with a warning. There is no doubt that the medieval liturgies and carnivals acted as escape valves to release the trickster element within society and religion. And if such a safety valve was blocked, how long perhaps would it be before a divine madness, or indeed frenzy, was to manifest itself within mainstream Christianity? Thank you very much.